Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. We all experience moments when God's love and presence are tangible, but we can also experience feeling utterly abandoned by God. Why? Why does God sometimes feel so far away? The reason for this could be your attachment style, or in other words, your style of relating with other people. Some of us have parents that make imagining a loving father more difficult. And some of us have parents that make it easier. In this episode, I'm going to talk about how your early childhood experiences and the attachment or emotional bond that you developed with your parents influenced your relationship with God. We talked a lot about attachment in last week's episode, so if you haven't already, I want to encourage you to go back and listen. But essentially, attachment science tells us how we feel in relationships. And our attachment style describes the way that we learned as a child to get and keep connection with others. We're going to explore how your attachment style, developed from the specific pattern you learned to maintain closeness with your primary caregivers, often translates to how you seek to maintain closeness with God. So to get started, what are attachment styles? I love how therapist Crispin Mayfield describes them in his book, Attached to God. He describes attachment styles as the profiles of our basic approach to relationships. Like I just mentioned, they are the pattern of how we seek and maintain closeness and connection. This aspect of our personality impacts how we relate to parents, partners, children, God, and anyone else who is important to us. There are 4 different attachment styles that we can develop as children. The healthiest kind of attachment is called secure attachment, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But we all have ways that we reach for closeness that wear us out rather than bring us peace and rest. These patterns are called insecure attachment styles, and they tend to fall into 3 distinct categories. Using Crispin's language, these 3 insecure attachment styles are called an anxious attachment style, a shutdown attachment style, and a shame-filled attachment style. Understanding your attachment style helps you look at the maps you've been given for closeness and why they either work out or wear you out. So in the next few minutes together, I'm going to briefly describe each attachment style and show you how they often shape your relationship and experience of God. A lot of what I'm going to be sharing today is taken and summarized from Attached to God, as well as other research in neuroscience and attachment. The first attachment style is called secure attachment. Last week, I invited you to reflect on 3 questions when considering whether or not you developed a secure attachment bond with your parents as a child. But what exactly is secure attachment? How is it built? And what does it look and feel like in a relationship? When we are securely attached to our parents as children, we know that whenever we need them, they will be available, responsive, and engaged. Secure attachment happens when children naturally turn towards their parents without much worry about whether or not they'll be able to get what they need. This relationship doesn't have to be perfect, but it provides consistent enough connection that the child knows on a gut level that their parents can be counted on. Attachment provides an infant with their first coping system. In other words, it sets up a mental representation of the caregiver in a baby's mind, which can be summoned as a soothing mental presence in moments of distress. When a child is securely attached, they feel comfortable and confident enough to explore the world around them, knowing that they can always return to their secure base. Secure attachment is like owning the keys to a cozy cabin, which you keep in your pocket wherever you go. You don't need to stay in this cabin all day, but you know that you can go there whenever you're needing some comfort. And sometimes just putting your hand in your pocket and feeling the key is comfort in itself. That's how secure attachment can look and feel like in a relationship. But how is secure attachment built? Security is built on a relationship that is not dependent on behavior. Parents foster this true connection, this relational safe haven with their children through two primary ways. First, by helping the child identify their emotions and manage their inner turmoil through your own empathy and calm, steady presence. And second, by delighting in your child and communicating more than anything else that you love them. I love how clinical psychologist Robert Caron describes how secure attachment is built. He says that security is built in a relationship when we experience that we can be understood instead of punished, to express anger and not be rejected, to complain and be taken seriously, to be frightened and not have one's fears trivialized, to be depressed or unhappy and feel taken care of, to express a self-doubt and feel listened to and not judged. And then he says this, you need to be nurtured. You need someone who is wiser than you to draw near when you're struggling and to give you the support you need. So let's pause here for a minute. If our relationships with our parents were secure as children, how does this impact our relationship with God? Think about it. If you had these experiences with your parents, it's much easier to imagine God, your divine parent, with similar characteristics, attunement, and responsiveness. It's much easier to imagine a God whose love is not dependent on your behavior, who delights in you totally, fully, and unashamedly, whose first instinct is to understand rather than punish, draw near rather than reject, and listen rather than judge. When children and adults who are securely attached hear verses like Matthew 11:28, which says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest," their natural response is, "Of course, that makes sense." The loving and invitational mental representation of their caregiver that they developed as a child is their lens through which they view God. But what happens if we developed an insecure attachment bond with our parents as a child? If our attachment with our parents sets up a mental representation that we can draw on in moments of distress, think about how an insecure attachment style would hijack this picture, and how that mental representation would become the lens through which we see God. In fact, let's do a little thought or imagination exercise of sorts right now. If you were to imagine God looking at you, what might be the look in his eyes? If you were to imagine God walking up to you right now, what would his facial expression be? When a lot of people do this exercise, they imagine God as frustrated or disappointed. That's more about insecure attachment than anything else. Theologically, they know that God loves them. Cognitively, they believe that God embraces and delights in them. But that's not who their heart, their gut, their nervous system knows God to be. In church, they know what they think about God, but that is vastly different than how they feel about him. They've been told that God is close, but their actual experience, their relationship with God, is much more confusing. There's a disconnection here on the visceral level. There's this sense that they do not feel as close to God as they've been told they should or would. They long for closeness and strive to make it happen. But even when they know they're close, something still feels wrong, like they're not wanted. When thinking about this through an attachment lens, it makes perfect sense. If we didn't develop trust in our nervous systems, a trust that we're going to be cared for by our primary caregivers, then our brains couldn't form on the neurological level with the capacity to anticipate this kind of care from God. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are 3 insecure attachment styles. What I'm going to do right now is briefly describe each of them and how this kind of attachment style can shape our relationships with God. As you listen, I want to invite you to reflect on your own experience and be curious if you resonate with one of them. The first insecure attachment style is called anxious attachment. Anxious attachment is a pattern of worriedly seeking closeness with God, fearing that the moment we relax, we will backslide into separation. We're convinced it's entirely up to us to maintain closeness with God, which means we never actually rest with God. It's up to us to stay close to God through prayer, regular church attendance, or scheduled Bible reading. This kind of anxious spirituality develops within a family system where the child ends up feeling that keeping connection with their parents rests wholly on their shoulders. A feeling that many of us have picked up in our faith communities as well. This approach to closeness prevents us from ever resting in the embrace of a loving parent and pushes us to cling anxiously to them. It's exhausting, but better than being abandoned to disconnection. When we can't trust our caregivers to come close in our time of need, we have to scheme up our own map for closeness. We know our parents care, but we're not sure if they care enough. If we're skeptical that they will help us during the agony of disconnection, our best strategy becomes avoiding any distance at all. The second insecure attachment style is called shutdown attachment. Shutdown attachment is a pattern of trying to stuff down our negative emotions to get close to God. It is based on the presumption that emotions such as fear, sadness, pain, and doubt are incompatible with the life of faith. So we try as hard as we can to not feel these feelings, often using religious language like, God is in control, so why should I worry? Shutting down these feelings seems like the path to becoming a person who truly trusts God. What kind of family system does this kind of spirituality develop in? Well, parents who struggle with managing their own emotions will often send subtle signals to their children that feelings are not welcome in the family. To get the closeness they need, the children learn to shut down their emotions because they've experienced how emotional expression either results in punishment or their parents pulling away. As long as the child doesn't share too much, they can keep connection with their parents. These children learn that when they cry, mom gets angry or dad gets uncomfortable. The best way to stay close is to lock their feelings in the basement. If we learn that our parents aren't comfortable with emotional closeness, we will walk a tightrope of getting close, but not too close. In a way, the distance becomes a way of maintaining closeness. We keep connection by shutting down emotions that might threaten that closeness. The third insecure attachment style is called shame-filled attachment. Shame-filled attachment believes that the best way to get close to God is to shame and blame ourselves for falling below the standard of perfection. We tell ourselves that if we could just be a little better, we could get close. But we can never transform quite enough. So if we can't become adequately holy, we can at least punish ourselves for not being good enough. We end up trying to get close by proving to God that we know how bad and unlovable we are. This kind of spirituality develops within a family system where we received mixed messages about our parents' feelings towards us. We can't trust that they want closeness. One day they seem to love us. while the next day they seem annoyed with or outright hostile towards us. In the worst situations, we live with the threat of abuse and violence, even on the days when our parents tell us how much they adore us. We take this hostility to mean that there's something wrong with us, something that makes us undeserving of love and closeness. So we try to become a different person, someone our parents might love more. When we can't, we end up punishing ourselves for not being someone worthy of love. This looks like the child who continually criticizes himself in his head before his parents have a chance to. If he can find all his faults, he'll be prepared for the shame that is waiting for him as he tries to get close to his parents. Let's pause again here for a minute because I just want to give us some space to reflect before we end. Is there one attachment style that you felt your heart resonate with, that seemed to put words to something inside of you? A common thread in all three insecure attachment styles is this felt sense that honestly sharing our emotions with God is not okay. But here's the thing. Intimacy happens in emotional interactions within relationships. When we hide our emotions with God, we never get the closeness we long for. We show up in our bodies, but we have trouble connecting heart to heart. It's when we listen to our hearts and share our honest feelings with God that we find connection with our divine parent, who longs to hear our emotions and help us understand them. But in order to share your emotions with God, you first need to know, on a gut level, that God can handle them. A question to consider. When you imagine yourself fully releasing pent-up emotion with God, what comes up for you? What do you feel in your body when you picture yourself raging at God or weeping with Him? Another common thread in all three insecure attachment styles is this constant striving, this burning of energy, trying to maintain connection with God, as if the burden of connection is on us. But our bodies respond and relax in the presence of someone who likes us. Another question to think about. Have you ever considered that God delights in you? That He enjoys being with you right now, today, exactly as you are? Listen to what Crispin writes about this. He says, "We don't want to be told we're considered perfect because of Christ's work. We want to be wrapped up in a huge hug. We don't want to be acquitted of crimes in a divine courtroom. We want to be invited back into the family. We don't want to escape punishment so much as we want communion." And he continues by saying, the chasm between who God says He is and who we experience Him to be is not crossed by whipping our minds into submission with more theological facts. We need the experience of being accepted and loved before we can change the story. In my own life, I've experienced this to be profoundly true. The chasm that I've often felt between who God says He is and who I've experienced Him to be hasn't changed with more theology. Rather, my felt experience of God has become more aligned with who I know Him to be as my body, my nervous system, has experienced being loved and accepted over and over and over again. A few weeks ago, I released a podcast episode with a family friend named Chip. This episode is called When Your Spiritual Growth Feels Frustratingly Slow, and in it, Chip says something at the end that I've thought about so much since our recording. He was processing a wounding experience that he had with his dad as a kid, an attachment wound that has stayed with him for decades. And then he said this, and this is what I keep thinking about. I think back to that story when I was a kid, and I know that Jesus would have been there. That's truth. But I couldn't see him. But I can see my friend's eyes looking at me when I'm struggling. And there's something profound that happens as my brother or sister holds my story that changes my own experience of my own story. I'm learning the power of the community, the power of the other. When I used to tell that story about my dad when I was a kid, it used to completely upend me. And the fact that I can tell it now is because I've seen love in brothers and sisters' eyes as I've told it. God has used the presence of people to heal me. I can see Jesus in their eyes, and I can sense his love through their love. When we can't envision the loving eyes of Jesus like Chip, we need people who will embody him to us. If we developed an insecure style of relating as a child, we can develop earned, secure attachment in adulthood. How? By being in relationship with people who stay, like the people in Chip's story, who will hold space for our big emotions, and who will offer us love and acceptance in steady, consistent ways over 1,000 different moments, who will embody the eyes, facial expressions, embraces, and heart of Christ to us. This is how relational wounds heal, in relationships. The more our bodies experience being loved and accepted, especially in our places of wounding and shame, the more our capacity expands to imagine a loving Father who longs to foster a secure attachment relationship with us. A God who pursues us when we push back and welcomes us when we run away. A God who doesn't want only our best, but wants all of us. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy. If this conversation was helpful and you'd like more information about my other offerings to engage your story more deeply, check out my website, taylorjoymurray.co.